the New South. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend just one lecture seeing what's happening in the South. So the name of the game is there is a lot of sectionalism still in the United States even after the Civil War. So the industrialization, immigration, urbanization, all of those lovely trends of the Gilded Age, those are mostly in the North. So we're going to see what's happening in the South. We're going to look at Southern economy. We're also going to look at Southern society, especially after the end of Reconstruction. We're going to look at what happens to African Americans. And also we're going to look at some African American activists of the Gilded Age. So we're just going to look at seeing what's happening in the South after Reconstruction, the New South. All right, so let us begin. And so once again, the New South, like I said, we're going to see what happens in the South after Reconstruction. So first, let's review what happened during Reconstruction first. So this is a bit of a review. So remember what's happening is there is a disputed presidential election of 1776. One more time, a disputed presidential election of 1876. And remember, there's a couple of southern states that actually send back a couple of different election results, and it's a hot mess. And so what happens is they create an electoral commission of 15 people, and they sit down and they said, hey, let's figure this out. So from this disputed election of 76, we see the Compromise of 1877. And in this compromise, the Republicans get the presidency, so Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president, but the Democrats get something in return, and the Democrats get the end of military Reconstruction in this compromise of 1877. So remember, military Reconstruction, they divided the South into 5 different military districts, and so each district had kind of a commanding general in charge of it, but also there were boots on the ground where there were actually troops there, making sure, for example, that African Americans actually were able to vote, things like that. But what we're going to see is after 1877, Reconstruction ends, the officers go away, and what we're going to see is the rise of the New South. Okay, so this is just a little primary source. I believe this is a Thomas Nast cartoon. And so you can see compromise with the South. He's showing compromising with the South as a bad thing. And we'll see here's the American flag upside down. The Confederate flag is right side up. And then you can see this is a Confederate person from the South putting their foot on the grave of a Union soldier in memory of the Union heroes who died in this useless war. So Thomas Nast, the guy who's creating the cartoon, is pretty much saying that compromising with the South is equivalent to, stepping on the graves of the Union soldiers, right? It's not a good thing. Moving on. So we're going to look at the economy of this New South. And so first thing to understand is there was some industry kind of in the South, right? And we're going to see in some of the major cities, we're going to see some industry. So for example, by 1900, I'm going to just flip. There we go. Now you can look at these pretty pictures. So by 1900, which is like at the end of the Gilded Age, there were some 400 cotton mills in the South, which makes sense because the cotton is grown in the South. It makes sense that you shouldn't have to transport the cotton to the North to produce cloth. And so there were about 400 cotton mills in the South by 1900, and almost 100,000 people worked in those cotton mills. So that is definitely some industry. Here you go, some cotton mills. They're taking the cotton and they're making it into cloth or textiles. And also some of the major cities in the South are going to develop some industry. So, for example, Birmingham, Alabama was starting to become the center of the steel industry in the South, at least. Memphis, Tennessee had a lumber industry. Richmond, Virginia had a tobacco industry. And so some of these major cities in the South did have some sort of industry. But for the most part, most people are going to remain in the agricultural field. And so here we have just some fun facts here. All right, so for example, by 1900, which is kind of at the end of the Gilded Age, about half of the white farmers and about 3/4 of the black farmers were still tenant farmers or sharecroppers, so they don't own their own land. And so we're going to see, yeah, there is some industry in the South, but really it's going to remain mostly agricultural. And remember, especially with emancipated slaves, with African Americans, at least at the beginning, a lot of them after emancipation remained on the same plantation they'd always lived. So instead of being enslaved, they're now free, but they're typically working the same land, living in the same shack. But instead of being slaves, they're now tenant farmers or sharecroppers. So we're going to see that's pretty much the name of the game when we're talking about Southern economy. So here's a fun little slide. So a lost war, a late start, and a lack of capital is one of the reasons that the South really does stay mostly agricultural. And so this is going to be very similar to what was before the Civil War. So even thinking of a colonial America, like back in the day when we're a colony of Britain, remember Britain manufactured the goods and America produced the raw materials that we sent to Britain to manufacture. And so something similar is happening here, right? The South is going to produce the raw materials. Those are going to be sent to the North, and the North is going to create manufactured products. All right. We get the big idea. I hope so. All right. So what we're going to do is just one more slide of review, and then we're going to hop into the society of the New South. All right. So once again, review. So during Reconstruction, remember, the Southern Democrats have not yet come back into union with the federal government. And so a lot of Republicans in Congress, instead of just passing laws, decide to pass amendments to make sure that the Southern Democrats don't just come in and overturn everything. And so remember, these are the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment was emancipation, and this is the official one, 1865. 14th Amendment granted citizenship to African Americans, so meaning that they enjoy the same rights as all the other citizens in the United States, or at least they're supposed to. And then the 15th Amendment gave at least African American men the right to vote as well. So this is just a review. Remember those Reconstruction Amendments. So what's going to happen in the New South is those amendments are still in the Constitution. They're still in the books, but they're going to be chipped away at in the New South, to say the least. So the first thing we're going to look at is preventing the black vote. So preventing African Americans from voting. So they have the right to vote, 15th Amendment, but what we're going to see in the New South is that's not going to be what actually happens. So we're going to see, once again, we're just going to read this very, fun fact. Here we go. Fun times with the Constitution, just to read through it quick. Just to remind us of what the 15th Amendment says. 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And then Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So that's what's on the books, but that's not what's going to happen in the South. So we're going to see a couple of different ways that African Americans are prevented from voting. So we're going to look at literacy tests, poll taxes, the Grandfather Clause, and of course the KKK. So we're going to look at all of these. We're going to hop into all of these. All right, we shall begin. Literacy tests. So literacy tests are supposed to prove that you're able to read and write, right? Literacy tests. However, these literacy tests were oftentimes very overcomplicated and very unfair. So someone who's very educated might not be able to pass a simple literacy test. So we're going to just look at an example of this just so you can kind of get a taste. So this one is from Louisiana. There's more to this test, but it's a little sample of it. And so in total in Louisiana, at least this test, there was 19 questions. You had 10 minutes to take it. And if you missed any of them, you failed, right? And so you can kind of just read through a couple of these to see how kind of complicated and like not very straightforward these questions are. So, draw a line. You can read through them, but draw a line around the number or letter of the sentence. And it's like, what does that even mean? The number or letter of this sentence? And so you're supposed to draw a line around. So apparently they wanted to draw a circle around the number 1. But if you made a square, that did not count because it's supposed to be draw a line. And squares have 4 sides. So that wouldn't have worked. Right? So you can just see they're kind of overly complicated, not fair, and not a really good assessment to see if someone can read and write at all. All right, so above the letter X, mark a small cross. Draw a line through the letter below that comes earliest in the alphabet. You know what I'm saying? All right, you get the point. Another thing is the good old poll tax. So a poll tax is a fine or a fee or a tax, if you will, that you would have to pay in order to vote. Typically, they weren't much more than $2, but if you were absolutely destitute, you wouldn't be able to afford to vote. And so poll taxes, once again, are preventing the destitute from voting. And so here's a little receipt from the poll tax in 1896, 1895, something like that. So I guess this one is $2.50. So it's a tax to vote. And if you're destitute, you wouldn't be able to pay it. Well, say you're white. And say you're illiterate, and say you're destitute. Well, don't worry, because you can still vote. Why is that? Because of the grandfather clause. So the grandfather clause typically said you are exempt from the literacy test and the poll tax if you, your father, or your grandfather were able to vote before 1867. And I think 1867 is a date specific to Louisiana. So pretty much whichever state you're in, if you, your father, your grandfather could vote like before African Americans were allowed to vote, then you didn't have to pay the poll tax or take the literacy test. So pretty much if you're a white and you're in the South, you didn't have to worry about the literacy test or the poll tax, right? Because obviously African Americans, their father or their grandfather certainly weren't voting before 1867. So it was a loophole for white folks who were poor and didn't know how to read or write. Okay, so, and of course the last thing we have to mention again is the KKK. So the Ku Klux Klan, once again, they're going to be using the threat of violence to prevent people from voting. And so we'll look at the KKK again. But there's going to be kind of 3 waves of the Klan. So the first one is really during the Reconstruction era. The second one, the 1915 through 1944. And the third one, 1950 to present. And just so you can see, because once again, when we're talking about the New South, it's going to start in the Gilded Age, but it's going to be around for a while. And so what we're going to see, this little map here, is the Klan chapters that were in effect between 1915 and 1940. So this would be the second wave of the Klan, if you will. So you can see how, like, ubiquitous this is, how all over the place this is. And so once again, just even the threat of terror or the threat of violence would prevent you from even thinking about voting. Okay. So once again, that 15th Amendment that guarantees the right to vote, that's not so much going to be enforced in the New South. Okay. All right. Next amendment we're going to see more or less practically repealed in the South is the 14th Amendment. So remember, the 14th Amendment gives citizenship to African Americans. And so they were afforded all of the civil rights that every other American citizen was awarded, at least on paper. So here's the 14th Amendment. Fun times. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So pretty much, if you're a citizen of the United States, you have the same liberties, the same rights as every other citizen of the United States. On paper, That's not what's going to happen in the New South. So let's see what happens in the New South. One thing that I may have mentioned already are black codes. So black codes are laws that are going to take away rights from African Americans. And it depended on the state or the county or the city, because each had their different sets of black codes. But for example, these are all examples of black codes, and they're going to look familiar because they're pretty much like what the slave codes were before, but now they're for emancipated African Americans. So these are just examples of different black codes that could be out there. So African Americans couldn't hold meetings unless white people were present, couldn't travel without permits, couldn't own guns, couldn't sit on juries. They couldn't join the state militia, testify in courts against whites. They couldn't be absent from the workplace without permission from their bosses. They couldn't hold certain jobs like being mechanics of buildings or repairing housing, and they had to sign long-term labor contracts. And if they were to jump the contract, if they were to run away, if you will, the capturer is paid $5.10 per mile to drag you back so you fulfill your contract. And so once again, you're supposed to enjoy equal rights as everyone else, except for in the South. Black codes, right? So this is taking away their civil liberties, their civil rights. So that's one example. Another example of civil rights being taken away are Jim Crow laws. So now Jim Crow laws are like the segregation laws, right? The separation laws. Black codes are specifically taking away rights from African Americans. Jim Crow laws are the segregation laws, right? So Jim Crow laws, state and local statutes or laws that legalized racial segregation. All right, so we're going to look at some examples of some Jim Crow laws. Okay, so here's a picture. So once again, the era of Jim Crow is going to last about 100 years. So kind of from the end of Reconstruction up until the 1960s. Mid-1960s. And so the era of Jim Crow is going to be around for like 100 years. And so, yeah, this picture is not in the Gilded Age, but it's definitely in the Jim Crow South. All right, moving on. Let's look at some laws. Let's put myself over here. All right, so examples. So this one is Alabama 1930. It shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in the company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. So no interracial checkers for anybody. In Arkansas, it shall be unlawful for a white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained or tied to a Negro prisoner. In Atlanta, and this is 1926, I think I'm covering up the date, no colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. And Nebraska, marriages are void when one party is a white person and the other is possessed of 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood. And then 1915, Oklahoma, the corporate commission is hereby vested with the power to require telephone companies in the state of Oklahoma to maintain separate booths for white and colored patrons when there is demand for such separate booths. So once again, Jim Crow laws are the segregation laws. It's a nickname for the segregation laws. So we're going to talk about where this name Jim Crow comes from. All right, let's put myself here. So during the Gilded Age, and before and a little bit after, something that was very popular were minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were like talent shows or like variety shows. And in these minstrel shows, oftentimes you would have actors that white actors that would put on black makeup to make themselves appear as if they're black, and that was called blackface. And so what would happen is oftentimes in these minstrel shows, as these characters or as these actors are portraying these kind of black characters, we're going to get some pretty gnarly black stereotypes going on. And so, for example, one of these characters, one of these blackface characters from the minstrel shows was Jim Crow. And so Jim Crow, here we go. Move myself over here. So Jim Crow was one of these stereotypical characters that were created for these minstrel shows. And so the term Jim Crow, like Jim Crow laws, is actually attached to one of these characters that were developed by a blackface actor in the minstrel shows. Okay, so once again, 15th Amendment giving citizenship to African Americans, we're going to see that chipped away at with black codes and with Jim Crow laws. But even during the Gilded Age, there were some people who were trying to push back against the Jim Crow laws. And so this is a famous Supreme Court case we're going to unpack called Plessy versus Ferguson. All right. And so we're going to set up the case, like what's the setup, and then we'll look at the aftermath of this Supreme Court case as well. So the first thing we have to understand before we can even hop into what happened is this idea. So we're going to talk about the one-drop rule. So if you're going to have a state or a region of the United States where you have all of these segregation laws, it gets tricky because there's people who are mixed race. And so the idea is, well, if you're dividing society between white and black, what about people who are mixed raced? And so for the most part, the one-drop rule, and it depended on which state you were in, but the one-drop rule pretty much said that you were legally colored, you were black, or at least you're not white, if you had at least one great-grandparent who was black. So, for example, this is just in case you didn't know how this works. There's you, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. So if you had at least one great-grandparent who was black, that means you were colored or you were black. At least you're not white if you have one great-grandparent. And so it depended on the state, what was the actual distinction, but keep that in mind, right? When you're dividing the society between white and black, it gets a little bit tricky when you have mixed race people. All right, so this is going to come into play now. All right, so this is Homer Plessy, the guy from Plessy versus Ferguson. And so he is from New Orleans, Louisiana, and he is 1/8 black. So he's still considered black or African American under the law. His ancestry is actually French/Haitian, so he was actually Catholic. He's from New Orleans. That's Homer Plessy right there. And so he really wanted to challenge these Jim Crow laws. He didn't think they were constitutional. And specifically, the law he focused on was something called the Separate Car Act of 1890. So when I'm saying Separate Car Act, I'm not talking about an automobile, I'm talking about a train car. And so in the state of Louisiana, there was a Jim Crow law, a Separate Car Act, which said there'd be separate train cars for white passengers and for black passengers. And so he wanted to challenge the legality, the constitutionality of this law. And so he's going to get arrested on purpose. America. And so this is what happens. So he's in Louisiana, where the Separate Car Act is underway, and he purchases a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad, okay? And so when the train conductor goes around to collect the tickets, he's told to leave the train car and go to the colored car, go to the black car. And he refuses. He says, no, I paid for a first-class ticket. I want to stay in this car. And so he is arrested. And like I said, he's arrested on purpose. He wanted to get arrested so that he could challenge the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act of 1890. And so actually when he was actually traveling with a detective who had the power to arrest him, because he wanted to make sure that when he was arrested, he would be arrested with actually violating the Separate Car Act and not just arrested for vagrancy or something like that. So this was completely set up, right? He wanted to challenge this rule, and so he made sure he was arrested for breaking this specific rule. All right, so he challenges it, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And what does the Supreme Court say? Well, the Supreme Court says, you know what? Jim Crow laws are constitutional, and kind of the rule of thumb is separate but equal. So Plessy versus Ferguson, if you can connect that to the doctrine of separate but equal, you're doing great. right? And so I think this was like a 7-1 decision. So overwhelmingly, the Supreme Court said that segregation was fine. It doesn't go against the 14th Amendment as long as it's separate but equal. But as this cartoon is lovely showing us in a very obvious way, separate was hardly ever equal. And so what we're going to see, these Jim Crow laws, pretty much all public facilities are going to be segregated. Schools are going to be segregated. And so really what we're going to see is the establishment of kind of second-class citizenship, especially for African Americans, especially in these southern states or these Jim Crow states. And so Plessy versus Ferguson, if you ever want to throw the Supreme Court under the bus, you could be like, yeah, Supreme Court, but remember Plessy versus Ferguson or maybe Dred Scott? Those were both your decisions. Maybe you don't always make the best decisions, Supreme Court, just saying. And as not to, spoil anything, but just so you know, the Plessy versus Ferguson, this idea of segregation, of Jim Crow laws, of separate but equal, it will be overturned, but it won't be overturned until the 1950s. We'll dive into that more later. But 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka is going to reverse the earlier decision okaying segregation. So the Supreme Court is going to change your minds, if you will, but that won't be until 1954. All right, moving on. All right, so once again, the question, you got to beg the question, how are we going to fix all these problems? Specifically, after the 10 years of Reconstruction is up, once we see the rise of the New South, well, how are we going to fix these problems? And so what we're going to look at right now are some Gilded Age African-American activists. And so these 3 men are going to come up with very unique solutions to how to fix all of these problems. So we're going to look at them one at a time. We're going to see a little bit about like who they are, and also we're going to see the solution that they're offering during the Gilded Age. Let us begin. Excuse me. All right, the first guy we're going to look at is Henry McNeil Turner. There's Henry McNeil Turner right there. And so he's a bishop in the AME Church. So AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the idea is this is one of the first denominations that's specifically for African Americans, right? And so he's going to be a bishop of the AME Church, and he's going to spend his life, more or less, founding these congregations across the United States. So that's probably what he's most well known for, founding all of these different AME churches across the United States. However, he also has something called the International Migration Society. And his idea or his solution is just to go back to Africa. He believes that living in the United States, African Americans are never going to be given full rights of citizenship. And so he says, you know what, we need to go back to Africa. And this sounds a little bit, kind of crazy now, but remember, this is a trend that has been going on for a while in American history, and we'll see that in just a second. So he creates this International Migration Society, and he gives it a shot. So there's 2 ships and about 500 people will actually go to Africa and try to continue the colonization efforts in Liberia. Let me explain. New slide. Whoa. Okay. So just as a review a little bit, this idea had been around for a while. So the 1820s, 1830s, the idea of Liberia had been around. So just fun fact, not going to be on a test, but the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. It was named after President Monroe. So think back like the era of good feelings. That's when this idea started to originate. And so this isn't new, but he's going to kind of hop on board this idea. And so what happens is these 2 ships, about 500 people show up, and we're going to see a lot of them decide to go back to the United States because there's going to be a lack of economic opportunity in Liberia. Of course, there's going to be quite a culture shock, and then exposure to a lot of new tropical diseases. So we're going to see this idea not work out the best. And so a lot of these folks are going to head back to the United States. So once again, Henry McNeil Turner, he's probably better known for founding a lot of AME churches, but also that was kind of the solution he had. He's like, we're never going to be treated as equal citizens in the United States, so we might as well raise our children somewhere where we can be treated as equals. All right, so this is just kind of a little fun Iowa fact. So in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, did you know there's an AME church? So the AME church in Cedar Rapids was actually established back in 1870. So even kind of during the era of Reconstruction. This is a picture kind of the original church back here, and then 1930s, a new church or a brick church replaced it. And so this is kind of fun. The AME Church is on the National Register of Historical Places. And then if you're a local Cedar Rapids style, here's the library, here's the Museum of Art, and then over here is the Bethel AME Church. So kind of fun Iowa connection. Moving on, Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington, he was a slave. So he was born in Virginia, but emancipation came for him at the age of 9. And so he is most well known for founding Tuskegee Institute. So Tuskegee Institute, it's a college, right? It's called Tuskegee University today. It's still around. And so he's founding this institute in Alabama, and it's a normal school, which is just another way of saying it's a school that trains teachers. So he founds Tuskegee Institute. It's a normal school. It's a school that trains teachers. It's in Alabama. And really when he starts off, it's really nothing more than a couple of rundown buildings. So he really builds it from scratch. And what he has, or his idea of the solution to this kind of second-class citizenship African Americans have been given, is the idea, it's called the compromise stance. Now, he doesn't call it the compromise stance, but the compromise stance is the idea that it wasn't time to challenge Jim Crow, right? Instead of putting our effort towards challenging Jim Crow and Jim Crow laws, instead we should work on the long-term goals of education and business. And so he says, instead of challenging Jim Crow laws, instead put our effort into education, into building Black businesses, and then white rights and respect would naturally follow. And so this was called the compromise stance, if you will. But once again, he's saying, we only have so much effort. Let's not put effort towards Jim Crow laws. Let's instead work on long-term goals. Once we become educated, once we become an important part of the economy, then rights and respect would naturally follow. And so with this, he put his money where his mouth is. And so he decided to build up Tuskegee Institute to do just that, to focus on education. So we're going to look at a couple of fun slides with the Tuskegee Institute, and we'll talk about the Tuskegee Institute here or there throughout American history from here on out. So Booker T. Washington is founding it. So so there it is. So there it is in Alabama. Once again, it's still around today. All right, so this is probably Booker T. There's George Washington. There's Frederick Douglass. That's fun. All right. And here's some kind of famous folks that came out of Tuskegee Institute that you get to know about. So George Washington Carver. So he's going to become a professor at the Tuskegee Institute. And he's the one who's really connected with the peanut. The idea is he is very much involved in horticulture, so like farming and stuff. And so he realizes that planting cotton year after year after year is not really sustainable. And so he's really encouraging people to add peanuts into the crop rotation. Not only is that going to add more nitrogen back to the soil, but also it's a good way to work against, if something goes wrong with your cotton plants, at least you have a backup. That makes sense. And so he comes up with over 300 different products that would use the peanut to encourage people to plant peanuts instead of just cotton. Also, fun fact, he originally graduated from Iowa State University. He was the first African-American student at Iowa State, and then he became the first Black professor at Iowa State, and then from there he went to the Tuskegee Institute. Also, he did not invent peanut butter. That is a misnomer. So if you woke up this morning thinking George Washington Carver invented peanut butter, you are wrong. The end. All right. Another thing we're going to look at more in World War II is the Tuskegee Airmen. So during World War II, we're going to have a group of bombers and fighter pilots who are going to be coming out of the Tuskegee Institute. And we'll look at them more later. And there'll be a couple of other things we'll sprinkle in as we go on. But just to kind of formally introduce it, Booker T. Washington, Gilded Age, Tuskegee Institute. All right, moving on. Go up here. So the next guy is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are oftentimes pitted against each other, if you will, in history, because their ideas conflict a little bit. All right, not violently, but just the ideas conflict a little bit. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he's the first African American to earn his doctorate from Harvard. I believe it was in sociology. Okay. And so what he's going to do is he's going to become a leader in something called the Niagara Movement. And the Niagara Movement is going to evolve over time into the NAACP. So he's a leader in the Niagara Movement, and then he's going to be one of the co-founders of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. All right, so what was his solution, right? Booker T. Washington said, don't worry about the Jim Crow laws, just focus on bettering education and businesses, and then rights will naturally follow. W.E.B. Du Bois says, no, right? We want our full civil rights respected now, right? We want an increase in political representation brought about now. And so who's going to make this change in society? Well, he believed the Talented Tenth would do so. So the Talented Tenth comes from his speech he gives. And he's saying, kind of, if you think of the top 10% of the African American community who are educated, they're the ones who would lead this social change. So pretty much he's saying, no, we shouldn't just bow down to Jim Crow. At least those of us who are able to get an education should be working together. This Talented Tenth should work to change society now, not just wait for it to maybe unfold later on. And so, like I said, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are typically held up side by side saying which one's better. And like I said, Turner, he's perhaps more well known for founding the AME churches. But once again, these are going to be at least solutions offered even during the Gilded Age. But what we'll see is the era of Jim Crow is going to be around for a while. So it's not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s before we start to see Jim Crow start to go away. Praise the Lord. All right. So let's just review real brief. We're looking at the New South. So what happens in the South after military Reconstruction ends? Well, we're going to see the Southern economy is really going to remain agricultural. Hey, bangs. We're going to see some industries, like we're going to see some cotton mills come to the South. We're going to see in some of the major cities of the South some other industries forming. But for the most part, it's going to remain largely agricultural. Okay. Southern society in the New South, we're going to see all of these civil rights kind of going away, at least for African Americans in the New South, preventing the African American vote, black codes, Jim Crow laws, the Supreme Court upholding these segregation laws in Plessy versus Ferguson. And then we saw some Gilded Age African American activists who are trying to, even in the Gilded Age, fix some of these problems.